let's see how the third attempt for the launch of the Vanguard satellite turned out. On the 17th of March, 1958, the Vanguard did launch successfully and did achieve orbit and had successful deployment, and the third time happened to be a charm in this case. You don't need to have a date in your notes. This is a prototype, a mock-up of the grapefruit size Vanguard in comparison to the basketball size shape Sputnik 1. There's another mock-up of the Vanguard satellite, this one on display in the Kennedy Space Center that is in Florida. And you'll see what we do want you to have in your notes about the Vanguard satellite in this clip from History's Most Moment.
Satellite, the oldest man-made object in space. On October 4th, 1957, the world watched in awe as Sputnik became the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. The Russians had taken round one in the race for space, and the toll on America's national pride was devastating. Desperate for their own bragging rights, the U.S. government fast-tracked a small scientific program called Vanguard. Its new mission, launch a satellite as fast as humanly possible.
So all of a sudden, this very simple, very modestly funded program was thrust into the limelight, and unfortunately, it was shoved into that role a little bit too early.
Indeed, on December 6th, 1957, the United States was again humiliated, this time on live television. A second launch also held disastrous results. Finally, on March 17, 1958, the Vanguard satellite was delivered to the heavens, orbiting the Earth at an altitude of over 2,400 miles. At 6.4 inches in diameter and weighing only 1.4 kilograms, Vanguard was considerably smaller than the basketball-sized Sputnik. But the satellite did boast at least one major innovation. 6 solar panels provided power to its transmitter for far longer than the chemical battery of its rival. But the most long-lasting innovation of this satellite was its orbit. While Sputnik and other rivals have surrendered to gravity and met their fates, Vanguard's higher orbit has allowed it to remain perched above the Earth.
Vanguard 1 is still in orbit. It is the oldest artificial satellite now circling the Earth. Long, long ago it had fallen silent, but it can still be tracked optically, and it's expected to stay in orbit until about the year 2200.
To date, Vanguard 1 has circled the Earth over 160,000 times, traveling more than 5.6 billion miles. And if current estimates hold true, future generations will look up and see Vanguard 1, the longest orbiting man-made satellite.
And that's what we want you to have in your notes for Vanguard, that it is still the world's oldest orbiting satellite. Now, of course, in 1958, we wouldn't have known that it would be historical for that accomplishment. So, Vanguard, the oldest satellite still in orbit. Now that we have the ability to travel outside of our atmosphere and orbit our planet with satellites, we need to have a regulatory body in our government, and so it was established, this organization you're probably very familiar with, called NASA, as this class really is a look at the history of NASA. In case your eyes can't read this whole description of what the acronym of NASA stands for, give you a moment to jot it down. It's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Many people think it's NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency. It's not actually a government agency, but administration. This is representing Earth, the Moon, several star patterns, and the concept that we're orbiting or leaving our planet. Perhaps one day envisioning travel to the Moon, but certainly orbiting and leaving our planet. I'll show you in a few slides what this is representing on the logo. The official date that you want to jot down in your notes for the beginning of NASA is the 1st of October, 1958. Not quite a full year, but almost a full year to the anniversary of the launch of Sputnik on 4th of October, 1957. The 29th of July, in parentheses there, is just because that's the date stamped on the act as it was submitted and put forth to Congress. But the official enactment date for NASA is the 1 October 1958. The reason we now have to have NASA is because now we're going to do research of not just flight within, but now outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And then for other purposes, like perhaps travel to the moon or Mars. This is the actual front page cover of the document that was submitted in July of 29, 1958, that eventually became the official act for NASA. Now, NASA did replace the organization of NACA, or perhaps NACA evolved into what is now NASA. You do want to jot down in your notes that NACA meant or stood for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. You don't have to worry about the date, but just showing you a few years after the beginning of airplanes. The NACA logo came in this wing form. There was also this logo or seal that prominently featured the Wright brothers in the center. So NACA ended with the beginning of NASA, and this is probably the most famous logo for NASA that you're most associate with. Not just to set alone the fact that your cover of your front notebook features this quite prominently. This red vector, as it's called, this red vector was incorporated into the design by the artist after seeing this particular wing model that was a test in a supersonic wind tunnel. So this is the red vector inspiration. The artist and these patches, these logos, are sheer artistry. The artist that developed the very famous NASA logo is James Motorelli. And this is the logo in a patch form. And when the vector doesn't go off the patch or off the logo, it's, I have no idea why, but it's affectionately called the meatball logo, where this one is known as the vector logo, when the red vector goes off the side. That is useless information you will never need to recall, but 40 years from now you will be able to recall that. I think it was 1976 when this worm logo, as it's affectionately known as, was introduced by the design team of Dan and Blackburn. And then in 1992, the new NASA administrator said that, nope, we're not going to use the worm logo anymore, and one person decided we're going to go back to the classic, what is now just called the meatball logo in general, whether it's off the vector is off the patch or outside the circle. But this worm logo that was only around for about 20-25 years has really stood the test of time, as it's very recognizable. A variation on this worm logo was the gold on the black. Variation of what we now just call the meatball logo, showing the year of establishment, 1958. Or one of my favorite interpretations of the NASA logo right here, Go Riverhawks, ridgeline all the way. Google Doodle in honor of the 50th anniversary of NASA, and then a 60th anniversary NASA logo. The time period 60 years before, when it first started in 1958, the first NASA administrator was Joseph Ames. If you've heard of the Ames Research Center, named after the first NASA administrator. This is your first board of directors for NASA. This is Jimmy Doolittle, a great war hero from World War II, Medal of Honor recipient for the Doolittle raid, or the raiders that bombed Japan to end World War II. He was asked, because he was the outgoing or the last president for NACA, if he wanted to continue on and be the first administrator for NASA. He turned it down. Just he had other pursuits for his retirement. NASA has many facilities, and they're located all across the U.S. and across the globe. But here's a look at the contiguous U.S. facilities. The headquarters is in Washington, D.C. for NASA. And NASA's not the only space administration. There is the Soviet space program, and this is the logo in full color for you here for the Soviet space program. A very recognizable hammer and sickle logo of the Soviet Union. And then in '92, officially, the Soviet space program ended, or more so was kind of divvied up. And the largest of the space agencies from the former Soviet Union is, in English, Roscosmos. And we often abbreviate it as an RC, Roscosmos, but in the Russian language it would be a P and a C. Some people criticize Roscosmos that they stole the vector and orbit logo from NASA, but that's actually quite a common theme in space designs throughout the decades. Since over the years I found that people thought there was only 2 or 3 major space agencies or administrations across the globe of planet Earth, I decided to include this now. It's a list of some of the major space agencies in play. It's certainly not a comprehensive, not a full list of the various countries' space agencies, but since we've mentioned Roscosmos, may as well draw your attention that we'll put a few of these country space agencies down here. So the year that it was established was 1992. Do you want to put that in your notes? 1992 is when Roscosmos was established. And a major achievement of any space agency would to launch your first rocket from your country. And Roscosmos did this in 1957 with Sputnik. Actually, some rockets before Sputnik. Now you might think, how on earth do you establish oneself in 92 but have an accomplishment from way back in 1957? This is kind of the shout out in honoring the former Soviet Space Union and the accomplishments that they have, or space program. So even though that seems a little odd, discontinuous in the years, this is in the headquarters of the Roscosmos. This is the actual HQ building. And it is in Moscow, right here within the Russian Federation. And here's the PK you'll often see for Roscosmos. And since we're here on this page, we're mentioning the beginnings of Roscosmos in '92. The 2 big space agencies that came out of the former Soviet space program was Roscosmos, as mentioned here, but also the Ukrainian space program. So that was also in 1992. That was when the Soviet space program broke up. Roscosmos and the Ukrainian. The State Space Agency of Ukraine logo is there. And where we would kind of shorten up State Space Agency of Ukraine in English, it would be turned into NSAU, National Space Agency of Ukraine. In the Ukrainian language, I think their acronym is pronounced Ukraina. And this is the headquarters building in Kiev. And here is Kiev on the globe for you. So Russian Federation up here, headquarters of Roscosmos, and right there the headquarters of Ukraine now. All right, musical pages to page 2. And we will check off another great moment in the timeline of space explorations. So the Soviets have the first human-made artificial satellite, the first mammal in space. Who do you think has the first photograph of Earth from orbit? What do you say? What do you say? Yay, USA! And you don't have to have this in your notes besides the check mark, but in 1959, the very first picture of Earth from orbit. Yes, that is planet Earth. as taken by the Explorer 6 satellite there. So check 1 for the United States. How about the first impact on the moon? So taking an artificial satellite and placing it on the moon. You're probably familiar with the U.S. wanting to be the first to the moon, so you probably would think the U.S., but it's actually the Soviet Union. You just need the check mark. You don't have to write in your notes that it was in September of '59, Luna 2, first impact on another celestial body, and just happened to be the moon. And within this capsule, there was this token, this memento of a sphere recognizing the date and coming from the USSR. That CCCP is in Russian, USSR. You see the space program logo there ever so slightly.